friends, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. You know, one of the core technologies that I believe is at the center of any home lab, and especially my home lab, is virtualization. Now, it doesn't have to be, like you don't have to have virtualization at the core of your home lab for it to be a valid home lab, because your home lab can be whatever you want it to be. But what I've come to find, virtualization is something that is definitely very common at the core of many home labs. And the reason for this, as we've discussed in the past, is the ability with using virtualization to be able to run multiple operating systems and applications on a single server. So back in ye olden days, before virtualization was a thing, if you wanted to run two different operating systems, you needed two different computers. Which, as you can imagine, gets quite pricey quite quickly, especially when you consider all the extra hardware you have to procure, in addition to all the additional power draw that comes with running a second machine. So being able to essentially have all of this in a single machine can help save on things like power, space, and just overall being more efficient with your resources. Having a single dedicated server, or maybe one or two if you're clustering these, rather than having a single server for each application that you're trying to run. Now, it should be noted that yes, there are some applications out there that do indeed need the resources of a fully dedicated server, or in some cases multiple, in the case of applications that use something or operate on like a distributed file system, for instance. But for the home lab, that's usually not the case, or rarely ever the case. But if you are a home labber that needs all of the resources of a single server for one application, I would love to know what you are running and why you need to use a full server for one application. So definitely shoot me an email if that's you. contact@darkassassinsinc.com, link down in the show notes. Or if you're on YouTube, you can just leave a comment as well. But speaking of which, if you listening just have any general topics, comments, or ideas that you want covered on the podcast, you can either leave a comment below if you're on YouTube, or you can shoot me an email. Again, that's contact@darkassassinsinc.com. And again, the link is in the show notes below. But specifically for this episode, I kind of wanted to go over some of the strategies and choices you can make with your hypervisor in order to best utilize it. So I guess apologies in advance if you're listening to this on, say, a weekend or an afternoon or something, and your entire rest of your day or weekend gets completely derailed because you decided to implement some of these. Apologies in advance. But before we get into all that, let's start off with our trivia question for the week. So in 1993, three individuals created a new technology company based around the belief that the next wave of computing would be graphics-based. And they named their company after the Latin word for envy. What is the name of this company? So that is your trivia question for the week. Now, we got a lot of stuff to cover when it comes to home labs and virtualization, so I think we will just get right into this week's cybersecurity tip. This week's cybersecurity tip is something that you should definitely be keeping in mind the next time you go to sell one of your electronic devices, and that is to ensure that you wipe your drives and devices before you give them away. Because if you're like me, you probably have and use a fair bit of used electronics, specifically if you're getting them from places like eBay, or maybe you're buying them from Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, wherever you're getting your used electronics. If you're like me, you probably use used electronics, and if you're also like me, there's a decent chance you've booted up the new device that you just got your hands on, and you've noticed all kinds of personal data on that device because the person before you didn't bother to wipe the drive inside. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've come across this. Now, I am not a bad actor, so I'm not in the market of harvesting this data and using it maliciously. And quite honestly, whenever I get a used device, pretty much the first thing I do anyway is just completely wipe it and reinstall the OS anyway, regardless of if the seller claimed that they already did that, because I have trust issues and because you weren't the one that did the install. You can't verify that they didn't put something malicious underneath it to, spy on you or track you or whatever the case may be. Unlikely, but it's something that has happened before, not necessarily to me, but it is something to be mindful of. So that's why I personally recommend, if you're ever buying a used device, that you just do a completely fresh install of the device, regardless of if the seller claims that they did that already. Now, getting back to the personal info, if someone were to come across a used device that was owned by you, and on that device you were doing things like your taxes, handling stuff with your bank, having banking information on there is a strong chance that if a malicious actor gets their hands on that, they will almost certainly use it to steal your identity. Because on all that information, they have things like your banking info, probably your birthday, social security number, all the good and easy stuff they need to easily steal your identity, open up fake credit cards, open up fake bank accounts, call to various accounts that you might control and essentially impersonate you, because they know all of this secret personal data that in theory only you should be able to know. So it's really just not a good thing to have your personal data get leaked like that. So I would definitely recommend you are wiping your devices and your drives before you give them away, because but in order to do that, you also kind of have to take the proper precautions to ensure that you're securely wiping any and all personal data off the drive, because it's not as easy as just reinstalling the operating system and calling it a day. Now, that will essentially remove all easy access to any personal data that was on that device, but it doesn't get rid of it, because as we've discussed before, just because you delete something doesn't mean it's actually gone, because at the end of the day, all your sensitive data is just ones and zeros. Now, if you don't overwrite those ones and zeros, you're not actually getting rid of the data, because when you do something like delete a file, I think we've mentioned this on the podcast before, but essentially from the operating system level, you just essentially no longer point that pointer in the file system to that block of memory on the disk. So essentially, from the operating system's perspective, whatever space on the disk that file was taking up is now freely available to be rewritten to for some other data. But that doesn't guarantee that that data actually is deleted, removed, overwritten, any of that. So there is still technically a chance that someone could come in with some kind of data recovery software and recover either in whole or in part those files that you thought were deleted. So there's a couple ways that you can securely delete and clear your drive. One of the ways that you can do that is essentially to fill it all with zeros. So you essentially go over, there's programs that do this, that you can, securely wipe drives and stuff. But essentially what they do is they go over every single bit on the drive and essentially write it to a zero value. And there are some programs that will do multiple passes of this, randomize the data, and really just clean the drive out. Now, you don't necessarily have to go that ham, but definitely doing something to ensure that you're securely wiping the drive is something that I would recommend. And then, of course, if you're selling a device, it's probably good to, set it back to factory defaults. That's probably another good option as well. But the big thing that you really want to make sure that you do is completely wipe securely any and all personal data off of the drive. And that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. So moving right along, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So this isn't necessarily something super nerdy per se, but I just thought I would bring it up since it is tangentially related. And that is, folks, we have an enabler in our midst. Now, I was having a conversation with someone who shall remain nameless, but they know who they are, about my 3D printing setup that I have at my house. Now, I mentioned a few weeks ago that I kind of got on the bandwagon that 3D printing is essentially a core fundamental of homelabbing, at least from my perspective, because I got into 3D printing stuff for my home lab, specifically a case for my Raspberry Pi. But in this conversation, they asked me a question which I personally hadn't thought of before, which I'm not sure why, but essentially they asked, why don't you just buy a bigger full-sized rack for your servers and then repurpose your 15U rack to hold the 3D printer and its supplies?
That's a great idea. I'm with that.
And one of the kind of arguments that they gave was it would be more my style anyway compared to, say, getting some kind of piece of furniture or some kind of stand or end table or something to put it on. Putting it in a essentially rack mounting the 3D printer would be something more my style, which, to be honest, I 100% agree, and that is a fantastic idea because personally, I've always had a plan for, well, I guess not always, because when I first got the rack, I didn't have a plan to get a bigger one. But shortly after I got my 15U rack and realized the space was filling up quite quickly, I had plans on getting a full-size, essentially 42U rack, just never pulled the trigger for various reasons. One of the biggest ones being logistically trying to fit a 42U rack with my current living situation where my 15U rack is not exactly a super easy or feasible thing to do at the moment. So that's why I kind of haven't done it. But it is something that I definitely want to do. But personally, I was thinking of just getting rid of the 15U rack or donating it or something, but essentially getting rid of it. But now I have this new idea to essentially repurpose it to hold my 3D printer. So I think that was definitely a fantastic idea. But again, we have an enabler in our midst because someone is trying to convince me, even though I didn't really need any convincing, that I should get a bigger and better rack mount system and rack in general for all of my various servers. So I think it's safe to say that once I do have a better dedicated space for a full-sized rack, this will probably be my full-time solution for the 3D printer because currently it's basically just sitting on my kitchen table, which granted is not the best solution, but it gets the job done, I guess you could say. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about in this section was getting back to your semi-regularly scheduled Xserve content. So if you thought that all of the drama of my backup script was over, you would be incorrect because... Now, if you're unfamiliar with kind of this whole saga, there was a time about closing in on 2 years ago. We're kind of closing in on that time. I created a backup script that was essentially a combination of Ansible playbooks and a bash shell script that would essentially automate the entire process of me archiving and backing up my TrueNAS system onto my Xserve. Now, I ran into various hurdles and roadblocks along the way, with things not working quite as they did, interrupting the automated script and causing things to fail. But I ran into a rather peculiar issue that I had never run into before, and so I kind of kept this from you because this was about a month ago, because I honestly had no idea what was going on, and I kind of wanted to get a little more information before I kind of, brought it up. So essentially what happened was, about a month ago, I tried to run my backup script, and while it technically didn't fail, it didn't work either. And what I mean by this is, I got to the point in the backup script where it had finished archiving the TrueNAS system. It had copied the data over to the Xserve. It had completed the checksum generation on the TrueNAS system, and it was getting ready to generate the checksum on the Xserve. And I thought, great, fantastic. Everything is moving along as planned. And then a few hours go by, which is typical because the Xserve takes like a few hours to actually generate the checksum, because we're talking about a multi-terabyte file here. So it's going to take a while to compute that checksum. So that was understandable. But then we pass like the 6-hour mark, the 7-hour mark, the 8-hour mark. And at this point, we had gotten to like a full 24 hours, and I still had not gotten the notification that the Xserve had completed the checksum and the backup was complete. And I was like, okay, something is definitely going wrong here. So I did some looking around, and what I found was the Ansible playbook was trying to check to see if the Xserve was up. And I was like, that is weird, because the Xserve obviously is up because it got the archive copied to it. And I was able to log into the Xserve, verify all this, but no checksum generation had started, and I was really scratching my head at what the heck was going on. So then I decided, okay, this playbook is obviously not working. We're just going to kill it. So I stopped it, and then I tried doing the basic Ansible command, which is essentially just doing an Ansible ping to the Xserve, and that didn't work. I got the exact same behavior that I was seeing in the backup script, which was essentially it would just hang there and not progress any further. It wouldn't error out. It wouldn't say it wasn't able to, ping the Xserve or anything. It would just hang, which I had never seen that before, and I was really confused as what the heck was going on. But because of like time restrictions and stuff, I didn't really have time to really dig in too deep as to what was going on. So I kind of decided, we'll just table this and we'll investigate this further later. So then maybe like a week or so later, I tried running an Ansible playbook on my virtual machine that I have running in my Proxmox cluster. And of course, I was getting ready to get put on my debugging hat and really figure out what was going on, only to realize that Ansible worked no problem. So I was like, okay, so something has to be up on the Xserve that is causing this playbook to fail, and I, for the life of me, can't figure out what's going on, because I did some looking online, tried to find some potential solutions, and none of them seemed to work, so I was kind of at a loss. So then this past weekend or so, this past week, I guess, I decided to give the backup script another run. But before I did that, I wanted to really try to identify what the heck was going on with the Xserve. Because for whatever reason, like I mentioned, Ansible just could not talk to the Xserve at all. So it turned out that the reason why this happened was because Ansible was trying to run the essentially Python program, the ping program that it copied over to the Xserve on the Xserve, but the issue was the Xserve wasn't able to run it because for some reason, I guess the Xcode license agreement hadn't been signed, or I guess I needed to re-sign it or re-agree to it. And because of that, it was essentially hanging because in the background it was trying to produce a pop-up essentially saying, hey, you haven't signed the Xserve license, or not the Xserve, the Xcode license agreement, and you have to do that before you can proceed. And that was essentially what it was getting hung up on. So of course, as soon as I actually go and do that manually, run the Ansible playbook, and it works no problem. It works like a champ. And then of course I decided, okay, this is all working now. Let's give the backup script another shot. And then of course it ran through all of its paces and was able to complete no problem. And just for a little bit of context, because I was saying this generally takes a while, the actual backup job from start to finish ended up taking just shy of 19 hours at around 18 hours and 45 minutes. So while that is definitely a very long time, part of that is actually happening in parallel. So the portion of generating the checksum on the TrueNAS system and the copying of the archive to the Xserve runs in parallel. But also it should be noted that while it did take almost 19 hours to complete, I didn't have to do anything with that. I literally ran a single command on my control/jump box and then went about my day, went to sleep, all that good stuff, and didn't even have to worry about it. And then I just watched the notifications slowly roll in over the course of the next few hours. So if you are using a Mac for, what I should be saying is if you're using Ansible to control a macOS host, and for whatever reason your Ansible playbooks are hanging, that would be something that I would definitely look as your possible solution, is logging into the system and making sure that you are fully up to date and agreed to your Xcode license agreement, because there's a strong chance that that is probably why it is not working and it is hanging and not outright crashing and failing. So that was what I got up to this week. But now let's get into this virtualization discussion. So I guess first, when we're talking about virtualization in the Homelab, we kind of have to first discuss kind of what virtualization is. So essentially the idea of virtualization is the process of creating virtual versions, or kind of software-defined versions, if you will, of physical computing resources such as servers, storage devices, networks, and then these virtual resources allow multiple operating systems and applications to all run on a single machine, effectively partitioning hardware into multiple isolated environments. So this is essentially the technology that allows you to have a single computer or a single server running multiple different operating systems on it. And there's a couple of different types of ways that you can do virtualization. Of course, one of the most common ways is to use something like a hypervisor that creates virtual machines, which the hypervisor is kind of the technology that manages the resources of the system, that allows the virtual machines, which are essentially these fake or multiple, as far as the virtual machine is concerned, it's its own complete operating system, but allows these multiple operating systems and virtual machines all to run simultaneously on the same hardware. So the reason why, kind of as we mentioned, why virtual machines and virtualization in general is so powerful, especially to the Homelab, is because of the hardware resources, flexibility, and just that ability to minimize your actual hardware and server footprint while also being able to run a lot of services. Because as we kind of touched on in the intro, it's a lot more it's better resource wise, more resource efficient, better power efficiency, and just overall just better efficiency wise to kind of put as much as you can onto a single system and just kind of split it off and isolate it into virtual components to ensure that you're not running like 20 different applications on a single host, because as we kind of touched on before, in previous episodes, as part of cybersecurity tips and whatnot, the more ports you have open, the more services you have running, you just grow and grow and grow your attack space. And then if one of those applications gets compromised and you have 20 applications all running on one single system, if that system goes down, all 20 of your applications goes down. Whereas if you're running things in virtual machines, because everything's kind of isolated, if one of those virtual machines for whatever reason gets taken down, your entire infrastructure doesn't also go down with it. So that is another one of the reasons why virtualization is so good. But also it provides flexibility for things like testing and development, and being able to simulate production environments without needing multiple machines in order to do that. And that's another one of the reasons why I touched on that every software developer should have a home lab, because you can do things like this. You can create build environments, you can create test environments in order to test your builds. And if you need a build environment specifically for a certain operating system, you don't have to worry about procuring a second system just to do builds on that. You can just spin up a virtual machine and do all your testing there. So that's kind of one of the common use cases, especially for software developers. And one of the use cases, and I'm trying to remember how many virtual machines I'm up to as far as testing environments, but I have multiple virtual machines, in my Proxmox cluster dedicated specifically for software development, testing, and all that good stuff, developing applications and so forth. But another use case that people commonly use Homelabs for and virtualization for is, for various networking related things. So I don't know about how recent, it's kind of been a little bit now. But one thing that virtualization has allowed is to virtualize things like your firewalls, your intrusion detection systems, and things like this. So essentially allowing you to create full-blown network setups, just through virtualization. You don't necessarily need to buy all the various enterprise equipment in order to get that hands-on access and practice with it. And the other thing that, using virtualization in a home lab is beneficial for as well, is if you're going to go into, the enterprise world and have to deal with hardware, or not necessarily hardware, but deal with the production side of things, you're going to almost certainly be dealing with virtualization. So having that kind of virtualization background, maybe trying to go for some kind of certificate, could be, and getting that, basically having virtualization in your home lab would allow you to get some of that real world practice with that before you actually have to do it in a professional environment. But also, if you happen to be playing around with these technologies in your home lab, and then your employer comes to you with like a recommendation, hey, we're looking to bring in some kind of virtualization stack into our production, do you have anything that you recommend? And you can basically come with what you've been using in your home lab and essentially hit the ground running with that. So when it comes to virtualization, hypervisors, as we kind of touched on, are really the core of when it comes to virtualization. So there's really two types of hypervisors. You have your type 1 hypervisors and your type 2 hypervisors. Now, typically, when you're deploying a server specifically for virtualization, you're going to be using a type 1 hypervisor. And this is essentially, there's no operating system level. The hypervisor itself is essentially the operating system. It gives direct access for virtual machines to give them direct access to hardware, whereas your type 2 hypervisors are your things like VirtualBox, for instance, that essentially run on top of another operating system, whether that's Linux, Mac OS, or Windows, and then it has to kind of go through more layers, so it's not quite as efficient as running a hypervisor on bare metal, what like a type 1 hypervisor would be. So some of the bigger players in the game are, of course, VMware. VMware is kind of the big enterprise one, pretty widely used in enterprise for its various robust features and stability. It, of course, has the company VMware backing it, and then it has a bunch of different management capabilities through things like vSphere, vCenter, and the whole ESXi suite for scalability and whatnot. And then you, of course, have Microsoft's solution, which is Hyper-V. Now, I've recently kind of started using Hyper-V a little bit more, and it's honestly kind of slick in the sense that you don't have to. It's weird in the sense that, unlike ESXi or Proxmox or XCP&G or one of those other kinds of solutions, Hyper-V is essentially just an additional feature in Windows, but is also like a type 1 hypervisor. So it's like integrated by default, I believe, in Windows Server, but you can also enable it in certain just regular versions of Windows. Although I think you need it's at least the Pro license for Windows, but I could be mistaken. But if you are using it in just vanilla Windows, it is something you have to enable, in that I think it's like enable features and programs or something, but you can just natively enable it. So essentially, if you're running a Windows device, you really don't even need to download something like VirtualBox if you don't want to, in order to get virtual machines up and running. Now, from my understanding, it's primarily used for Microsoft products, although it does support Linux virtual machines as well, which is of course, my primary use case, because I generally, most of the services that I run on Linux virtual machines. I don't have a whole lot of Windows virtual machines in my infrastructure. I think I have a testing environment and then just kind of like a testing Windows server. But aside from that, not a whole lot of Windows in my virtualization stack. But it is something that you could do. But the one of the things that most of these hypervisors allow is for you to back up like your virtual machines and create snapshots and all this kind of stuff, which, as we'll kind of get into later, is super nice when it comes to a feature to have. And then, of course, the next one that's very common is Proxmox, which I am definitely biased towards because that is my hypervisor of choice. Proxmox is open source. Essentially, it's basically Debian with KVM mixed in there, which KVM is the kernel-based virtual machine, and kind of built into Linux. It's a Linux-based hypervisor, and Proxmox is super popular amongst homelabbers. One, because it's free and open source, but also two, just a lot of people use it, and it's a pretty solid hypervisor in my opinion. So when it comes to the security of these various hypervisors, pretty much all of them allow you to have isolation. So, and essentially that being when you create virtual machines, the hypervisor ensures that those virtual machines are completely separate and isolated and can't talk to each other unless you have like a networking system set up between them. By default, they're not going to be able to talk to each other. So being able to prevent like security breaches. So in the instance, if you're running, say 3 virtual machines on your hypervisor, one of them gets compromised, that one compromised virtual machine isn't going to, by, association or by the fact that it's on the same system, compromise the other 2 virtual machines as well. So having that isolation is definitely something that's very nice. ESXi offers isolation features. Hyper-V does it as well, and as of course Proxmox and KVM do it also. Now, another potential thing that you could have when it comes to security is Secure Boot. Depending on the hypervisor that you're running, it may or may not support secure boot. I know, for instance, if you're running Windows and Microsoft Hyper-V, that of course just supports it, and I believe VMware ESXi supports it as well. Not sure if Proxmox does, but essentially what secure boot does is it essentially allows you to ensure that no funky business is getting added into the boot process, because during the secure boot up, it essentially is doing multiple various, cryptographic checks. It's kind of the simplified version. It's doing various cryptographic checks to ensure that nothing at like a low level has been injected, into your boot process. Now, this can be kind of annoying if you're trying to, install something that doesn't have secure boot enabled. So it's kind of, it might seem scary to disable secure boot, but that is something you might want to take into consideration when trying to choose a hypervisor. And then, of course, managing your patches. So pretty much every hypervisor out there is going to have some sort of avenue that they deliver patches through. Depending on which one you choose, that may or may not be a little more straightforward than the other one, but it is something to consider. And then as far as kind of some of the performance, trade-offs, so resource overhead. So hypervisors like, VMware ESXi and Hyper-V have a lot more resource overhead, partly due to their, rich feature set, but also in the case of Hyper-V, you're essentially running Windows. And we all know Windows is not exactly the lightest weight operating system, whereas compared to something like Proxmox is very lightweight, and it's not very resource intensive, so you can really ensure your VMs are kind of getting all of the attention they deserve, and you don't necessarily have to ensure you're allocating multiple cores and gigabytes of RAM specifically for the operating system, in this case the hypervisor. Now, of course, that is something you're still going to want to do, but there is going to be less resource overhead for something like Proxmox, which is another reason why it's so common in Homelabs. And the last thing I want to touch on here is hardware compatibility, which is another reason why Proxmox is kind of the king in Homelab situations. Because things like VMware ESXi, for instance, require a certain level of hardware compatibility. You can't just, build a system and expect ESXi to be supported. Of course, there's also licensing considerations, but the key thing here with ESXi is even if you're using enterprise grade servers that were supported under ESXi, there's a decent chance, depending on how old your system is, that it's not supported under the latest version of ESXi, which Proxmox, of course, doesn't have that issue because, again, Proxmox is essentially just Linux with, a hypervisor on it, right? So, and Linux can basically run on anything. It can run on a potato, of course, not actually, but the system requirements to get something up and running with Linux is very minimal. Linux can run on a wide variety of devices, and you can almost guarantee that Proxmox will work, because if you can install Linux on that device, you can almost certainly install Proxmox. And that's also kind of another thing you have to keep in mind if you're going to use something like Windows Hyper-V or Microsoft Hyper-V, is again those hardware considerations, because if you're wanting to use the latest and greatest version of Windows, for instance, you of course have to ensure that your system is whatever version of Windows you're trying to run, it's compliant with that version. And then, of course, if you're trying to run Windows Server, of course, there is that massive license charge that comes with trying to run Windows Server. So there's, of course, some trade-offs and things you have to take into consideration when it comes to selecting your hypervisor. Now, when it comes to some of the best practices for virtual machines and containers and whatnot, one thing we kind of touched on is almost all of these, hypervisor solutions offer things like creating snapshots, backing up virtual machines and things like this. And essentially, what this allows you to do is it kind of gives you a security peace of mind, but also allows for quick and easy testing of things. Which, if you're trying to, I don't know, develop an Ansible playbook, creating snapshots is a fantastic way to manage that, because essentially what you can do is you can create a snapshot in time of the virtual machine or the container or whatever, and then you can do whatever you're trying to do, install whatever you're trying to install, run whatever scripts you're trying to run, and then if it doesn't work, you can just roll back the snapshot and you're right back to where you were before you even did any of the installs, script running, or anything like that. So it allows you to have some very quick evaluating of software, evaluating of your install scripts and things like that, to essentially ensure that they're working as you'd expect. And kind of one of the benefits to that too is if you can create these automated scripts that install things like that for you and you can validate them, it makes, spinning up and deleting virtual machines kind of like, it's not that big of a deal if you lose a virtual machine, if you can literally just run a script and you're back to where you were before you lost that virtual machine. So snapshots is a way to kind of help in that process. But the other thing to remember too is having too many snapshots can have a negative effect on performance. So if you're not actively using some of the snapshots, it's kind of a best practice to delete them, to kind of free up that space and to kind of get some of that performance back. And it's also should be worth noting that if you're trying to do some kind of backup solution, snapshots are really not the best way to go, because what I've found is snapshots are great if you're trying to do kind of iterative things, like kind of really quick, but if you're trying to do like really big things and using them as kind of your backup solution, there are better ways to go about doing that. So for instance, in Proxmox, you can back up, entire VMs and restore, from backups, which is kind of my kind of go-to solution. But the reason why I don't do that for iterative testing is because if you're trying to restore from a backup, that takes a lot longer than trying to restore from a snapshot, because restoring from a snapshot, all you have to do is essentially take the difference between where you are now and where you were at the snapshot and revert those couple things, rather than essentially copying all the blocks that comprise the virtual machine back over to essentially reset it. So restoring from a backup, of course, takes a lot longer, but in my opinion, it's the best kind of long-term solution for ensuring that your snapshots, or not snapshots, but your virtual machines are backed up and you can easily recover from them. The other thing is to use templates. Now, there's a couple different ways you can go about doing this. My preferred version of using virtual machine templates is essentially keeping clean install images of whatever kind of operating system I want to run. So I have, essentially template images for Ubuntu, Arch Linux, and Red Hat. And essentially what I do is ensure that I'm always keeping these virtual machines patched and up to date with all the various updates and whatnot. It gets updated along with the rest of my servers during my Ansible update script. And then if I ever want to spin up a new application or spin up a new service or whatever, I can just easily clone that virtual machine template and don't have to worry about going through the whole reinstalling and setting up of a virtual machine and installing an operating system and all that stuff. So it can significantly speed up the process of getting new systems and services running in your Homelab. The other thing that you can also do is networking configurations. So most hypervisors allow you to essentially define networks within the hypervisor. So essentially you can have your own like switching infrastructure within the hypervisor itself, so you don't necessarily have to go outside the hypervisor. And the benefit here, of course, is improved networking speed, because if everything's happening locally within the device itself, within the server itself, within the internal network interface card, you can achieve a lot faster speeds routing things locally on the hypervisor itself rather than having to go out to a switch or going out to a router or something like that. So you can get significantly improved speeds. And of course, you can set up things like virtual local area networks or VLANs, firewalls, isolated virtual networks, the whole 9 yards. Whatever you want to do, you can essentially do in these hypervisors to ensure that your home lab is secure and your virtual machines are isolated if they need to be. And as we've talked about on other episodes of the podcast, ensuring you have that network isolation is definitely a key component of that. The other thing I kind of wanted to touch on here is container security. So one of the things that I know I have done is blindly downloading pre-built Docker containers and running them. Now, generally speaking, this is not exactly the best practice, but one thing I do try to do is ensure that the Docker containers I'm pulling are from the actual creator of the software. So for instance, Guacamole, not too long ago, I created an Ansible playbook to essentially set up Guacamole running as a Docker container. And as part of that, it essentially downloads the Docker container for Guacamole created by the folks that make the Guacamole project. So that is one thing that you also want to look out for. If you're pulling Docker containers, it's best practice to pull the ones by the creator of that piece of software. So for instance, if you want to set up a Docker container for Nginx, you probably want to pull the Nginx container from Nginx themselves rather than some third-party one, because you honestly have no idea what went into that third-party one, especially if they don't provide you the Docker file that was used to create that container. So it's definitely best security practice to not blindly pull and install Docker containers, and ideally you would be building everything from scratch yourself, but of course that can take a while, and that's why reinvent the wheel. But there are other tools that you can use to essentially scan Docker containers. Docker has a built-in one that you can run with Docker Scan. There's also other third-party solutions that you can scan your containers to ensure there's no funky business going on inside them. So those are kind of some of the security things that I kind of wanted to touch on when it comes to ensuring that you some of the best practices there. Now, when it comes to resource utilization, we kind of touched on one of the benefits of having a virtualization or a hypervisor running is the ability to utilize one system's worth of resources for multiple virtual hosts. So this is things like allocating CPUs, allocating memory. Now it kind of gets a little tricky here because you want to make sure that you're fully utilizing the CPU and memory of your hypervisor, but you also want to make sure you're not overcommitting those resources, because if you say have a CPU that has 8 cores and 16 threads, you of course want to make sure that that server is working up to its capacity, but you also don't want to run into a situation where you have say 8 virtual machines with 40 cores allocated to them because you over allocated resources. They're all trying to hit and use their resources at the same time, and you just run into massive bottlenecks all trying to contend for the same resources. Because one thing that most I think type 1 hypervisors, I know Proxmox definitely does this, it allows you to allocate more resources than you have. Now, this might sound like a bad idea, but you have to keep in mind, especially in a Homelab situation, at least for me, I can only speak from personal experience here, but for me, most of my virtual machines idle like 99% of the time. And even though I have at least pretty much, I think I have virtually all the CPU cores like of my Dell R620 allocated or very close to that, the kind of idle resource utilization of the CPU is like 5%. Now, of course, if I hit it with a load of something, like if I, start a build on, one of my dev virtual machines, or I kick off CI/CD pipeline and it starts doing a build like through that, of course that's going to increase the CPU utilization. But that's something you kind of have to watch out for, is you want to make sure that you're allocating, enough resources to make use of the system you have, but you also don't want to over allocate. So in an instance where you have, multiple virtual machines all trying to, run, heavy workloads at the same time, they're not, compete over, your system isn't oversubscribed in the sense that you don't have essentially 40 cores worth of CPUs and you only have like 16 cores of actual CPU, right? So it's one thing you have to keep in mind. And the other thing too with memory is you can, most most hypervisors have the ability for you to allocate various amounts of memory. So again, going back to Proxmox, because that's the one I primarily use, Proxmox allows you to allocate more memory to virtual machines than you actually have on the system. And if you've ever looked at your if like on your current computer right now, if you pull up either the like the task manager, activity monitor, or whatever resource utilization thing you want, you have so much RAM on your system, whether that's 8 gigabytes, 16 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes, whatever the case may be. There's a strong chance that your computer right now is not actively using all of that RAM. So essentially what this the kind of allocating more RAM than you have is you're kind of banking on the idea that not all of your virtual machines are going to be using all of the RAM that they were allocated all of the time. Now you've also can of course set limits for things like RAM and CPU utilization on virtual machines to essentially prioritize what virtual machines can use the resources. So of course, if you have a mission critical thing, like maybe you're wanting to ensure that your virtual machines that you do builds and tests on always have the resources available, you ensure that they have those resources available, but then you maybe limit the resources of another virtual machine. So if there comes to a point where there's a contention, you have the virtual machines prioritized that you want. And the other thing that you have to kind of keep in mind too is the storage component of this, because depending on how many virtual machines you're running, you're going to run into some I/O bottlenecks. So VMware, Hyper-V, and Proxmox all have different solutions for how that you can allocate your storage, and you can set quotas for essentially how much, and prioritize, kind of similar to the CPU and memory, kind of ensure that the virtual machines you want are getting the resources they need. But the big things that you kind of want to watch out for is, again, ensuring that you're adjusting your CPU allocations. So one, you can over allocate your CPU, which may or may not be an issue. You kind of have to look at your use case. So kind of as we touched on with VMware, Proxmox, and things like that, you can over allocate the number of CPUs, but you also, it's kind of something that you kind of have to have the inclination about of, okay, am I able to actually do this? Because of course, if you're running, say, virtual machines that are going to be pegged at the CPU, max CPU like all the time, of course, in those situations, you don't want to allocate more CPU resources than you have. But if say like 3 of my 10 virtual machines are going to be idling pretty much all the time, like occasionally they'll get hit with a load, but the majority of the time they're just going to be idling. That could be a situation where you could over allocate CPU resources and not necessarily have to worry about it too much. And then the other thing that we touched on too is memory ballooning, which is essentially this idea that okay, so you allocate this virtual machine to have, say, 8 gigs of RAM, but it doesn't actually hog 8 gigs of RAM just for itself. It only hogs what RAM it's actively using, which allows, the rest of the RAM to be distributed to other virtual machines that might need it. So that is definitely also something that you should probably look to enable as well. And then I/O throttling is kind of that piece that ties into the storage. You can essentially set limits to certain virtual machines if you want to basically prioritize one virtual machine over the other. If it's like a mission critical virtual machine, or it requires a lot of disk read and writes, you probably want to ensure that one kind of gets the priority versus another virtual machine that, say, maybe idles the majority of the time. Now, when it comes to storage, this is something that you kind of have to identify what you want your solution to be. Now, personally, I can only recommend using SSDs for your storage solution. And the reason why I say this is because when I first started on my homelabbing journey and working with virtualization and whatnot, I was using hard drives. And it worked. The only issue was whenever I would boot up the server, boot up my hypervisor, shut down my hypervisor, or do any kind of updates or migrating of virtual machines, basically the entire system would grind to a halt. All the virtual machines would grind to a halt because the read and write performance of those hard drives was so bad that one virtual machine having a high level of input-output operations, or I/O operations, would essentially grind all the other virtual machines to a halt because all the resources for the drives was being hogged by this, one virtual machine. Now, of course, I probably could have gotten around it by, ensuring that I was setting I/O limits and whatnot, but then, the virtual machines would have just been slow. So, yeah, basically, if you're going to be doing any kind of virtualization and you're going to have a fair number of virtual machines running, I can't recommend using SSDs, more than I am right now, because they will make a world of difference. Now, when it comes to your storage, there is something you also have to consider is how many drives are you going to have, because most hypervisor solutions will support some kind of RAID configuration. And then, of course, RAID is, independent array of independent disks or drives, or however you want to look at it. There's a couple different definitions, but essentially, it's the idea of combining multiple individual drives into one single drive that's then displayed to the operating system. Now, specifically when it comes to virtualization, my kind of personal pick is RAID 10. Because RAID 10 offers you not only redundancy but also performance increases. So we've done episodes in the past on RAID, so I'm not going to go super in depth for this episode. One, for the sake of time, but also since we've covered it before. But you could use something like RAID 0, which would give you the best performance when it comes to your disk speeds. The only issue with RAID 0, of course, is if you lose a drive, all the data on all the drives is gone. So if you are using RAID 0, I would just advise you that you have a very solid and frequent backup strategy, or you have some kind of strategy in place that you can easily rebuild all your VMs quickly, because if you lose a drive, all of those virtual machines are gone. So you want to make sure that you have, backups frequently, or you have scripts in place or Ansible playbooks or what have you to be able to quickly recreate those virtual machines. Because it is something you have to keep in mind. Now, RAID 10 is kind of the not necessarily best of both worlds, but unlike other RAIDs like RAID 5 and RAID 6, those two, RAID 5 and RAID 6, don't give you any write speed improvement. They just kind of add, but they do give you read speed improvement, but they don't give you write speed improvement because of the various parity calculations that have to go on to ensure that you can have drive failures without losing data. But how RAID 10 works, just as a quick recap, is it basically combines RAID 1, which is essentially a mirror, which is you have two disks and the data on one disk has a exact copy on the other disk. And it basically stripes those together. So it has a minimum of 4 drives, but any multiple to greater than 4 also works. Which I guess, as a side note, is kind of something that's really nice when it comes to adding to a RAID array, because for things like ZFS that will allow you to add additional drives to your RAID array, one thing you kind of have to do is essentially add, in pairs. So if you're running a RAID 5 array and you say you have 4 disks, you essentially need to add 4 new disks in order to expand the array. So the one nice thing about RAID 10 is you don't have to worry about buying a bunch of disks. You can just buy them in pairs at a time and install them, and you can expand your storage that way, which is something that is kind of nice. But anyway, we're kind of getting off topic here. So the striped mirror is essentially a RAID 0, which is the stripe. So all the data is written across all the drives, but then each one of the drives that it's written to has a copy of it, right? So you have your 4 drives. It's essentially striped across 2 of those drives, which will give you the improved read-write performance because it's able to write data to 2 drives at a time, but then it's also making a copy of that data on those 2 drives to the additional 2 drives, which essentially allows you to lose potentially 1 or maybe more depending on which drives fail without actually losing any data. So that's kind of a quick, brief overview of RAID. But again, we've touched on RAID before in the past, so you can go listen to some of those previous episodes if you need a recap. So that is one thing that can help improve some of the I/O bottlenecks. Is by having some kind of RAID solution like that, or using faster disks, which can help that input-output performance and address some of those bottlenecks. Now, when it comes to networking, there's a couple of things you can do to improve your networking performance. One of them is to do various networking optimizations like jumbo frames, which reduce the number of packets needed to transmit data, increasing the MTUs, or the maximum transmission unit, which can be beneficial for Homelab situations if you have like a high speed networking setup. So if you have like either a 10 gig, 40 gig, 100 gig, or something like that, it can reduce the overall CPU load, which can improve how much data you're able to pump out. And then another thing you can also do is something called essentially link aggregation. So if you have a hypervisor or a network interface card or a NIC with multiple network ports on it, you can, assuming your switch supports it, you can essentially join all those ports together to essentially increase your bandwidth. So if you if you have a network interface card or a NIC with 4 1 gigabit ports, you can essentially combine those all together to essentially get 4 gigabits worth of bandwidth for your system, which can, if you're running on, say, like a 1 gig switch, that can allow essentially 4 separate devices all to get the full 1 gigabit speeds just by doing that link aggregation. Then, of course, this scales too, so you can do it with 10 gig NICs, 40 gig NICs, etc., assuming that your switch, of course, supports it. So kind of an example here is if you're a Homelabber and you're, say, running some kind of media server, whether that's Plex or Jellyfin or something like that, and you have a NAS that kind of stores your media, which is a pretty common use case. You can essentially set up a link aggregation to the NAS to ensure that you have sufficient bandwidth for all the various clients that might be trying to connect to the media server. You can ensure that you're able to pump out enough data from your NAS and from the media server to be able to feed all those various streams. So when it comes to, we've talked about some performance things, we've talked about some security things. One additional thing that we've touched on kind of on the podcast before is the idea of using encryption, and specifically full disk encryption, for your machines. Now, when it comes to virtual machines, I don't necessarily recommend it as much, mainly because of VM disks that are encrypted add additional overhead, which can reduce performance. So it is kind of one thing to kind of make a note of. Now, most hypervisor solutions, of course, support the ability for you to do disk encryption, but it can, of course, slow down disk operations because of all of the encrypting and decrypting you have to do. Now, this is also kind of something you have to weigh on kind of a case-by-case basis, because if this is something that's super important to you, maybe it's worth the performance trade-off by ensuring that all your virtual machines' disks are encrypted, in which case, go ahead and do that. Another thing you want to look into is if you have any kind of hardware acceleration for that encryption. So depending on what CPU, this is kind of where you want to look at what CPU you're going to be running, because depending on the CPU, it might have certain crypto accelerators or it might not, which can definitely improve the performance, because if you can offload some of that encryption stuff at the hardware level, that can also kind of reduce some of the performance hits that you would accrue by doing a full disk encryption for virtual machines. So this is also kind of something that if you're trying to run, a virtualized firewall like pfSense or something, is also something that you kind of want to look into, because while you can run pfSense with a CPU that doesn't have the native crypto instruction sets, you're gonna see a lot. There's going to be a lot more CPU load, because it essentially has to brute force everything rather than having the hardware accelerators for it. Now, the other thing kind of on top of that one in security is antivirus, if you're planning on using that in any of your virtual machines, and then if you're using any kind of intrusion detection or prevention system, because if you're running those, if you've ever used antivirus before, antivirus can be quite the resource hog. So if resources is at a premium, specifically CPU resources, having all your virtual machines with an antivirus could potentially be a lot of CPU cycles and resources being hogged for no good reason. So that is something you also kind of have to look into. And then, of course, the intrusion detection and prevention system can potentially add a decent amount of network latency and significant CPU time if you're trying, depending on when and how much of your network you're running it on. Now, personally, I think kind of a good balance to this would be if you're using, say, a virtual machine to back up things like your, sensitive information, like we talked about, tax documents, banking information, that kind of a thing. That would probably be a virtual machine that you want to ensure you're doing disk encryption on. But if other virtual machines, like if you're just doing something for like a build environment or a testing environment for software development, you probably don't need full disk encryption on one of those virtual machines. Now, when it comes to utilizing an intrusion detection system, ensuring that it's, monitoring and scanning around, that VM with, your tax documents and whatnot is probably smart, but it might not necessarily need to be around your dev environment, because you could potentially be setting off the intrusion detection system quite frequently, depending on what you're trying to develop and test. So, just kind of an example there of, things that you could do. Now, when it comes to kind of monitoring all this, there's a bunch of different monitoring solutions when it comes to monitoring your virtual machines. One of the big ones that's common in Homelabs and that I've seen kind of in the enterprise is tools like Grafana and Prometheus, which is essentially like a dashboard type thing that you can use to essentially visualize things like virtual machines, containers, hypervisor, resource utilization, things like that, to essentially be able to have a visual picture of how much CPU memory and I/O you're using, which can be beneficial to ensuring that you adjust those allocations accordingly. So some, I guess, potential issues that you might run into with virtualization. One is this kind of idea of VM sprawl, which essentially is when virtual machines kind of grow out of control and consume more resources, and are constantly kind of competing for resources. And essentially, you run out of CPU or memory or whatever because you have too many virtual machines all vying for the same data. So one of the ways to kind of combat this is to kind of do an analysis of what virtual machines you're running. Are any of those virtual machines not being used anymore? Can you delete some of them? Can you consolidate virtual machines? Things like that in order to kind of get some of that space back. So essentially doing VM audits and decommissioning unused VMs, or enforcing quotas like, limiting the amount of memory a virtual machine can take up, or limiting the number of CPUs, that kind of a thing. And the other thing you have to keep in mind is, which I think kind of goes overlooked with virtual machines and hypervisors, is we get this idea that if you virtualize something, everything is contained and it can't escape. And that's usually the case, but it's not always the case, because there can be, if you have an unpatched hypervisor or misconfigured VMs, it could potentially expose you to security risks. Now, generally speaking, in a Homelab situation, this isn't a huge deal because you're probably not exposing a ton of stuff to the internet, which I hope you're not publicly exposing a lot to the public internet, if anything. But it's still best practice, of course, to implement strict security patches and always to be up to date on that kind of a thing. And if you really want to, you can even use a tool like Ansible to automate all those updates for you. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But when it comes to kind of some of these security things, there are potential ways that you can kind of skirt around the isolation of virtualization. And one of those is side channel attacks. So a few years ago, there was, of course, the Spectre and Meltdown exploits, which was essentially a weakness at the hardware level of the CPU, because the CPU is essentially trying to preload and guess which instructions would need to be run next. And if you performed an exploit you can essentially identify sensitive information from other processes that you do not control. So essentially what this would allow you to do is you could be in one virtual machine, exploit, a Spectre or Meltdown vulnerability, and essentially gain insight into what another virtual machine on the hypervisor is doing, which of course you're not supposed to actually do. So that is one potential thing you have to keep in mind. So virtual machines are essentially not bulletproof, but again, they're generally pretty good, but of course there is no silver bullet here, is essentially what I'm getting at. And the other thing you also have to keep in mind is we talked about, ensuring that your hypervisors are up to date as far as patches goes, because hypervisors aren't bulletproof either. For instance, there was a CVE in ESXi. It was 2020-3962. And basically what this CVE did was it allowed attackers with local access to a virtual machine with 3D graphics enabled to be able to exploit a vulnerability to execute code native on the hypervisor itself from the virtual machine, which again, you're not supposed to be able to do, because the virtual machine is supposed to be completely isolated from the hypervisor itself. But with this vulnerability in ESXi, you were essentially able to execute stuff on the hypervisor from a virtual machine, which, like I said, you're not supposed to be able to do. So these are kind of some things that you kind of have to keep in mind, that while yes, virtualization generally is pretty solid when it comes to ensuring things stay contained, again, it's not 100%, right? Like nothing in software is 100%. Nothing in security is 100%. So kind of to wrap up here, I kind of wanted to talk about some of the future planning, like planning for your home lab for the future and kind of things to look for. So one of them being is native virtualization support for the CPU. So this is things like your Intel VTD, AMD V assist, and essentially what this does is it offloads the some of the virtualization tasks like hardware, and allows virtual machines native access to the hardware rather than having to go through a software translation layer, which of course improves performance quite substantially. So for instance, the Intel VTD enables you direct access memory, or DMA, from devices to the virtual machines, which essentially reduces latency and increases the performance of various I/O intensive tasks. And as another thing that we kind of touched on earlier in the episode was this idea that essentially network virtualization, or being able to virtualize network appliances. So whereas before you essentially had to have a dedicated system for your firewall, a dedicated system for your intrusion detection and prevention system, a dedicated system for your load balancer, you can essentially virtualize all that now, which is fantastic for home labbers that want to kind of play around with these enterprise grade technologies, but don't necessarily have the cash flow per se to, buy one of those dedicated enterprise devices. You can essentially simulate it all and virtualize it all, and be able to use it that way. And personally, for me, I know, virtualizing, I think virtualizing like firewalls, for instance, has become a little more acceptable in the mainstream in recent years. But for me personally, the main reason why I like to virtualize my firewall is because I can easily back it up and save configs and that kind of thing. Now, of course, you could, download the config file for the firewall and be able to reload it and that kind of a thing. But having it as a virtual machine allows me to, one, easily back up the virtual machine. Two, I can create snapshots of the virtual machine so I can easily test things and change things and roll back if needed. And then, of course, the third thing is I can easily migrate my firewall between whatever hypervisor I want to use. So if I want to take the current hypervisor the firewall's on down for maintenance, I can just migrate the firewall to a different hypervisor and don't have to worry about any kind of downtime or anything like that. So that's personally for me why I like the virtualization route for some of that networking infrastructure. Now, as far as future-proofing the home lab, so we've talked about a couple different things, but when it comes to future-proofing your home lab, we've had entire episodes talking about, what hardware you should get. And we're not going to really get into that in this episode, one, because we're already kind of long on time, but also we've covered it before and almost certainly we'll cover it again. But the thing you want to kind of focus on is investing in hardware that, of course, supports virtualization technology. So, kind of that VTD for Intel and AMD vAssist. Now, most modern Intel and AMD CPUs will support this, but of course, if you're looking at older CPUs, which home labbers typically do, older used hardware, it is something you just kind of want to ensure. But also kind of making sure that you're planning for the future, right? Like you don't want to fall into the trap of buying something just because it's cheap, and then you find out after using it for a couple months that it doesn't have the resources you need and you quickly outgrow it, and then you have to end up spending even more money on a replacement. And if you just saved, a little bit longer, a little extra, you could have bought something originally that you wouldn't have had to upgrade so soon. Now, when it also comes to this is one of the reasons why home labbers one of the reasons why homelabbers like to play around with enterprise servers, like in my case, a Dell R620 or an R730. One of the reasons why we like to play around with this is, of course, addition into all the horsepower that you get, and actually playing with an enterprise grade system. One of the other niceties of these systems is their upgradability, right? They have socketed CPUs. In a lot of these enterprise systems, there's like 2 sockets, so you can have 2 CPUs. You can run 1 CPU now, and then if you need to add more CPU, more compute later, you can throw another CPU in there, depending on what generation of processor you have. You can maybe upgrade to a later generation processor to get even more performance and more cores potentially. Having extra RAM slots to be able to throw in more RAM if you need more RAM. Having PCIe slots to add different types of expansion cards like network cards or GPUs or things like that. These are some of the things that you kind of want to look for if you want to future-proof your home lab, is to ensure that you can grow and expand your server without necessarily having to buy a new one. Now you can even do this with consumer grade stuff too, right? There are consumer systems out there that do have socketed CPUs that you can upgrade them to potentially a newer generation or a different CPU within the generation. So for instance, a personal experience of mine, the first system that I bought for my home lab way back in the day was a Dell Optiplex 7010, I believe it was. And that originally came with an Intel Core i5 processor and I think like 8 gigs of RAM. But because it was a socketed chip, I was able to, down the line when I needed it, was able to upgrade to an i7. Still in the same generation, but still upgrading to the i7. So I essentially got hyper-threading, which, 4 more cores. And then, of course, it was faster, so even more performance there. And then it had additional RAM slots, so I was able to upgrade the RAM from 8 gigs to 32. And essentially being able to do those upgrades on a platform is something that you can use to your advantage to help future-proof your home lab. So you don't necessarily need to be buying new hardware constantly, although that is also part of the fun, but also kind of tinkering with the current stuff that you have, I think is also appealing and an appealing part of home labbing. But that's just me. I want to hear from you guys. So I kind of, we talked a lot about virtualization here. So I kind of want to know what your guys' experience with virtualization is. What's your experience been with it? Have you used any of the ideas or strategies that we talked about in this episode? What is your hypervisor of choice? Are you a Proxmox guy like me? Are you hardcore enterprise VMware all the way? Do you use Hyper-V? Do you use XCP-ng? Have you hopped around? Have you stuck to one? What's the biggest challenge that you faced with virtualization? Was it trying to get a virtual machine or service running? Was it the initial setup process? What has your biggest challenge been? All these things I want to hear from you. So you can either shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, or of course, if you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you guys. Now, before we end this episode, let's get to our trivia question. So in 1993, 3 individuals created a new technology company based around the belief that the next wave of computing would be graphics-based, and they named their company after the Latin word for envy. What is the name of this company? If you said NVIDIA, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. If you didn't get this one right, I don't blame you, because before I actually looked the answer up for the trivia question, I didn't even know it. So if you didn't get it, don't worry, you're not alone. But I think that's going to do it for this episode. So if you enjoyed, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review. And if you found it any at all helpful, definitely be sure to share it around with friends, family members, anyone that might be looking to have a home lab or looking to incorporate virtualization into their home lab, and also be sure to subscribe if you haven't done so already. And if you have any questions about this episode, or again, if you have any topics or ideas for future episodes, shoot me an email at contact@darkassassins.inc.com, or again, you can leave a comment if you're on YouTube. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.